Hi, I'm Ben Graham. Welcome to our lecture on the International Monetary Fund. So we're going to start into talking about the International Monetary Fund by linking back up where we were talking about financial crises, right? And we were talking about currency crises and we were talking about debt crises, and they're fundamentally quite interchangeable, right? So a debt crisis, we're talking about government debt generally in this case. So um, investors are starting to become worried that the government won't be able to pay back their debt or may decide to cancel their debt rather than pay it back, right? Because sovereign governments can do that. And so investors are starting to demand higher and higher interest rates to cover their risk, right? So in other words, investors are pulling back. So the supply of lending is going down, which means the price of lending is going up, right? So that interest rates are spiking. And it looks like the government's going to have to default on their debt, meaning the government's going to have to say, you know what, we're just not going to pay this back. Sorry, you guys are out of luck. Um, a currency crisis, on the other hand, which sometimes gets called the balance of payments crisis, is when the government, so this occurs in the context of a fixed exchange rate, right, where the government is trying to consistently intervene in currency markets to keep their currency pegged to another currency, often the US dollar, sometimes the euro. Um, and so the government is needing, so usually this occurs, the national currency is starting to decline versus the dollar, right? And so the government is intervening in currency markets. They're selling off the dollars that they're holding as reserves and buying up their own currency, trying to reduce the supply of their national currency that's out there in currency markets to drive its value back up to keep the peg, right? But they're starting to run out of reserves, right? So now they're in crisis, right? Because it's becoming imminent that they can no longer keep buying up the excess supply of their own currency, and so they're not going to be able to maintain the peg, right? As long as the government can borrow foreign currency, so as long as the government can borrow dollars and use those dollars to buy up their own currency, right? Then they're going to be able to maintain the peg. So as long as the government doesn't have too much debt, as long as there's no debt crisis, essentially, then there's no currency crisis, right? The government can borrow abroad to have the reserves to buy up their own currency. They can pull it off. So they're not really going to be forced to break the peg until they are also in a debt crisis. So that's why these things kind of swim together, right? Similarly, if the government has a bunch of debt, as long as they can print their own currency and use that to pay off the debt, right? As long as that works, right, then it can afford to pay its debts, and people aren't going to be too worried about a government default. So a currency crisis is a debt crisis, and a debt crisis is a currency crisis. These things kind of become interchangeable when we have sort of the open global capital markets that we have currently. So what does the International Monetary Fund, what does the IMF do in these crises? What is their role? And then we're going to kind of back into the broader roles and where the IMF comes from. But let's start with their role in crises. So the IMF is designed to be a lender of last resort. That means when private lenders will no longer give you money, if you're a government, you turn to the IMF and you say, we're having trouble borrowing anywhere else. Can you please give us a loan so that we can keep the peg or so that we can repay our other debts, right? So when a national government can't borrow on private markets anymore, the IMF steps in with a subsidized loan, right? So they're giving this loan at below market interest rates. Now, when you take out a loan to buy a car or to buy a house, right? Often there is collateral for that loan, meaning that, so I have a mortgage on my house. And if I stop paying the bank each month, if I stop making my payments, the bank is going to take my house, right? The value of that house backs the loan. This is how the bank knows they're not going to lose their money, right? If I stop paying them, then they come take the house and they sell the house to make themselves whole again, right? Now, for loans that don't have collateral, things like a credit card loan, there's no collateral on a credit card loan. If you default on a credit card loan, the credit card company is out of luck. So the interest on a credit card loan is much, much higher than the interest on a home mortgage, right? When you don't have collateral, there's much, much more risk. So how does the IMF reduce their risk? Well, they impose conditions on loans. So they don't take collateral, but they impose conditions. They say, we are going to lend you this money, but only if you do X, Y, and Z, right? And X, Y, and Z take the form of policy changes that are designed to fix the problems that created the crisis in the first place. So the economists of the IMF look at a nation's economy and they say, okay, these are the things that got you in this mess. And if you change this policy and that policy and that policy, then we'll give you money, right? We'll give you the first tranche of money. And then you've got to make some more changes. Then we'll give you the second bit. And then you make some more changes and we'll give you the third bit, right? So it's like this staggered thing where they're sort of twisting your arm and making you follow the policies that the IMF economists have decided are the policies necessary to allow you to be able to repay the loan, right? So they're trying to fix the underlying conditions, to put the nation's economy and to put government finances in a place where the government can afford to make the payments on the loan that the IMF is giving them, right? So these usually take the form of either raising taxes, cutting government spending, tightening up monetary policy, meaning reducing inflation, right? Or selling off state-owned assets, right? And often sort of a combination of all of those. You will notice that these tend to be, this is essentially the Washington consensus, right? So the IMF has been, kind of over the last 50 years, kind of the primary enforcement tool for the Washington consensus, right? Um, okay. So that's how the IMF operates during times of crisis. They come in as this lender of last resort, and they have a lot of power over national governments because they are the only source of capital available during these crises, and they will only give you capital if you do X, Y, and Z. So the IMF sort of has you over a barrel and forces you to adopt certain policies. All right, so now we're going to take a step all the way back to say, okay, so where did the IMF come from? How did this even start to exist? Right? So the IMF is part of the Bretton Woods system, meaning it's one of the institutions that was created at a ski resort in New Hampshire after World War II, right? Where the sort of the head finance folks from the victorious World War II countries gathered and designed what would be the post-World War global economy, at least among kind of the rich nations. Um, so the goal of the IMF, so their mission statement is to keep currencies stable, right? So at the time, there were lots of pegged exchange rates. Remember, most countries were on the gold standard, and then after that, they moved to the gold plus dollars backed system. But we're in this system of being on the gold standard, where you have to have enough gold reserves to back your currency, and then later you have to have enough dollar reserves to back your currency, and later you've got pegged exchange rates, right? So at their creation, it was about keeping currencies stable. In the modern moment that we're in, most countries have floating exchange rates. So their currency floats and the government doesn't try to intervene. And so currency crises are less of a big thing than they used to be, just because we have fewer pegs out there. Most currencies are relatively freely floating at this point. There's still a non-trivial number of countries with fixed currencies. And so the IMF does still play this currency stabilization role. But for a lot of countries with floating exchange rates, it's a lot about preventing economic collapses. Preventing government defaults is a real big one, right? So even if they're not as focused on currency crises because there's not as many pegs out there, they're definitely very focused on government debt crises, um, and they're also focused on promoting trade, right? So the Bretton Woods system was designed in the very early days of the Cold War, right? And so baked into the World Bank, which we'll talk about shortly, baked into the IMF, baked into the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which are kind of the three big pieces of this Bretton Woods regimes. All three of these are essentially neoliberal, kind of very capitalist focused institutions, right? Like this is part of their job is to generate economic growth for all the countries who are sitting at this conference, sustained economic growth. And part of their job is to promote capitalism globally, right? Particularly in contrast to the communist Soviet Union, right? So they have both a mission for what to achieve in terms of economic growth and economic stability. And also baked into their mission statement is how you're going to do it. You're going to do it with free market capitalism, right? So there's both a mission, sort of an end goal and a dictated set of means. Okay, so the IMF, they've got this mission of global economic stability, of making sure that lenders get repaid, of making sure that government defaults don't occur, right? And they kind of have three functions toward this end, right? The first is surveillance, collecting data and giving governments advice, right? So this is something the IMF does a lot. They publish data. They have a lot of teams of economists advising different national governments and kind of helping governments understand what's going on in their own economy, right? It can be really hard to make sense of what's going on in something as complex and dynamic as an entire nation's economy, and the IMF helps national governments do that. So the IMF is mostly staffed by PhD economists, right? They also provide technical assistance, which is to say they help train the statistics ministries and the economics ministries in a lot of countries around the world, right? So they're helping build the capacity, sort of the bureaucratic capacity to manage complex economies, right? To collect these data, to process these data, to link the data to government decision making about interest rates, about tariffs, about tax rates, sort of all of this stuff. And these two parts get talked about somewhat less because they're relatively non-controversial, right? I mean, so there are folks that think the IMF shouldn't be engaged in this, but I think most people are kind of okay with the IMF helping national governments collect and process data and producing forecasts about the global economy and helping train statistical ministries and training, the idea that we should have sophisticated government bureaucracies managing national economies is relatively non-controversial, and the IMF provides a lot of valuable assistance in that direction. Where things get more controversial is with the lending, because we talked about them stepping in as a lender of last resort, right? So their job is to make loans to countries who are facing balance of payments crises or who are facing debt crises, right? And so the goal here is to smooth out shocks and avoid defaults. And I think, again, that piece is relatively non-controversial. Like, we don't want government defaults to occur. We don't want economic crises to occur. We don't want huge recessions to occur. So the idea that there should be a lender of last resort out there who steps in to cushion these downturns, that's relatively non-controversial. And the IMF makes concessional loans to poor countries in particular, right, where those loans are either at no interest or at very low interest rates. What gets controversial is the nature of the conditions that the IMF applies in order to make sure those countries are able to repay them, right? So the idea that we have a lender of last resort, not so controversial. Exactly what types of conditions the IMF should apply, extremely controversial. Okay, so how does the IMF sort of function? How do they make their decisions? So, how do they have money to lend out in the first place, right? If they're the lender of last resort, they have to have money to give. And it comes from contributions from member country governments, right? And the largest contributor to the IMF is the United States. And a country's vote share. So a country's role in the governance of the IMF, all the decisions about to whom the IMF lends and at what terms and what types of conditions, all those types of decisions, your role in deciding IMF policy and guiding the IMF is determined by the share of your by how much of the total capital stock that the IMF has you put in. So if you put up the capital, then you get to make all the decisions about where it's loaned out to. So within the IMF sort of internal voting structure, 5% of the votes are allocated as basic votes, kind of one country, one vote, right? So everybody gets some say, right? Even if your country hasn't contributed anything, you get some say. But most of 95% of the votes are allocated according to how much capital you've put up, which means that the IMF is effectively controlled by the United States and to a lesser extent, Western Europe. Right? And so one of the things we'll talk about when we meet in person is whether this is fair, essentially, or whether this is the right way to govern it. Should poor countries have more of a voice, or is it actually fair that the countries who are putting up the capital decide where it goes? Like, what's the appropriate way to govern the IMF? So that's something we'll kind of have a little internal debate about as a class. So let's run through some critiques of the International Monetary Fund. Like I said, this is a very controversial organization, particularly that conditions on lending. So I'll sort of give you some of the key critiques and some of the kind of key responses, right? Trying to sort of distill what some of this debate is like. So the IMF takes a lot of flack for forcing too much austerity, right? So when they come in and they give a loan in a time of crisis, you're already down here. And they're saying, I know you're in an economic crisis right now, but you need to raise taxes, cut spending, sell off some state-owned assets, right? So you need to do things that are going to drive that recession even deeper, right? When you're raising taxes and cutting spending, that's going to make the recession even deeper. They're saying, look, that'll fix the long-term problem. You'll get, this is how you'll get your economy back on track and eventually be able to repay us. And so, the critique is, look, that's crazy. You can't you shouldn't be coming in with quite so much austerity. You should give the loan and allow time for the governments to sort of slowly move toward raising taxes and cutting spending. You shouldn't force that to happen right away. Let the recovery get going before you start to demand that kind of austerity, right? You shouldn't be imposing all this pain when we're already in a recession. And the counter argument coming from the IMF says, look, you're in a debt crisis or you're in a balance of payments crisis because you're spending more than you're taking in, right? You can't keep doing that. You're out of money, right? You're criticizing us for the fact you have to bring these things into balance, but you're just shooting the messenger, right? This isn't actually our fault. There's also an argument, so if you think about the first argument as kind of a critique coming from the left, there's also a critique that, well, I'm not sure if you position this on the left or the right necessarily, but you have a moral hazard critique, which says that that the IMF lets private lenders off too easily, right? Which is saying that, like, look, part of the IMF's job, right, is to stabilize international lending markets, and their big idea, right, is that, and this is kind of a very much like a capitalist's lenders first ideology, right? This is very much like kind of a neoliberal kind of economist-led organization. Um, their idea is that, look, if you have a system where private lenders are always confident they will get repaid even in crises, then private lenders are always willing to lend. We have very liquid capital markets. Capital can flow from rich countries to poor countries. We can get a lot of economic growth going. So key priority, make sure private lenders get paid back, get made whole, right? And people will say, well, that creates moral hazard, and what moral hazard means is this idea that um, somebody gets to benefit when things go well, but they're cushioned from the downside risk. So in this case, a lender, if the loan goes fine and they get repaid, they get this really high interest rate and a big profit. And if the government that they're lending to crashes, right, the IMF steps in and prevents them from taking big losses. So the IMF has prevented the lender from feeling the pain of the risk. And so they've made the lender relatively indifferent to that risk. So the lender knows if this government goes belly up, the IMF's going to bail me out. So I don't have to worry about that risk. And I'll go ahead and lend to governments, lend to firms that I know are going to crash or that I think might crash. Because if they don't crash, I'll get to make this nice profit. And if they do crash, the IMF will step in and bail me out, and I still won't take much of a loss. And so the IMF says, look, private creditors still do take some losses when the IMF comes in and bails out a country. There's always a big negotiation between the lenders and the national government and the IMF about who's going to take what losses, right? There'll be what's called a haircut imposed on lenders where they might get back 80% of the money they lent or 90% of the money they lent. So they'll take like a 10% or a 20% haircut on their loan. So the IMF will cover some of their losses, but not all their losses. And so the IMF says, look, we manage this moral hazard problem. We let them take we make them take some losses. So there's an argument about whether the IMF makes private lenders take a large enough haircut to induce them to be a little bit more risk averse next time around. Okay, so there's this critique that the IMF, that in imposing these austerity policies as part of the conditions on loans, and austerity being raising taxes and cutting spending, that's forcing pro-cyclical fiscal policies, right? Because you're already down in a recession. And so counter-cyclical spending, which is what you want to be doing, is when you're down in a recession, that's when government spending is increasing, not decreasing, right? And they're forcing you to decrease government spending when you're already in a recession. So that's pro-cyclical. The economy is already going down, and you cut spending and make it go down even farther. And so they're saying, look, you want to have countercyclical fiscal policy. So use that lending power you have to allow governments to wait until their economy is back on the upswing before they do this austerity. And the IMF says, look, by the time we come in, it's too late for that. Like, pro-cyclical or counter-cyclical fiscal policy has to start during good times. It starts with saving during good times, and then you can do the spending during bad times to smooth things out. Don't blame us for the fact that, like, now you're in a deep crisis and it's too late for that, right? It's not on us to not only bail you out, but to also bail you out so far that you can do it in a counter-cyclical way. So the IMF is saying that's asking us to go a bridge too far, take on too much risk, take on too much cost. Okay, and then the other critique. So remember, I told you that that the lending conditions were the really controversial part, but that sort of all the advice and the surveillance stuff was less controversial. But there is some critique about that advice as well, because particularly throughout the 80s and 90s, this was very, so that's sort of like the real heyday of the Washington Consensus. I'm not going to tell you the Washington Consensus has gone away, but I would say like its real peak, sort of peak Washington Consensus was like in the 80s and 90s, right? And the IMF was really pushing developing countries to open up not only to trade, but also to international capital markets. And this is, from the mid 80s through 2000, through the early 2000s is when foreign direct investment really boomed globally. You had tons of flows of foreign capital. This was like the heyday of the expansion of the multinational firm, right? We're still in the heyday of the multinational firm, but the growth rate of foreign investment was just incredibly rapid at this time. And a lot of that was the International Monetary Fund really pushing national governments, particularly in developing countries, to open up their borders to inflows of foreign capital. Um, and the critique here is that financial openness, particularly in small economies, led to a lot of volatility and generated some crises. And this critique was particularly sharp with respect to the Asian financial crisis, which we're going to be talking about quite a bit. And that occurred in sort of like 1997 through 99. And the counter argument is that the IMF might make is that the problem isn't openness per se. It's the combination of financial openness and too little trade. If you're Latin America in the 80s, in like the late 70s, early 80s, or financial openness plus poor regulation, which is the critique that IMF economists might make about sort of the Asian tiger economies that crashed in 97 through 99, right? And they would say, look, so as long as you have the right policy environment to go with the financial openness is fine. And besides, like the gains from financial openness are huge. There's a reason that the economies in Southeast Asia were growing so well in the early and mid 1990s, right? That this influx of foreign capital was huge for boosting economic growth, and you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater here, right? You want to keep the financial openness and then put the right domestic policy environment around it to cushion the risk, right? But financial openness itself is great for growth, right? So that would be sort of the argument coming in from the IMF. And I will say, like after the Asian financial crisis, the IMF has definitely made its recommendations a little bit less extreme with respect to financial openness, particularly for small economies. They're saying, well, with respect to hot capital in particular, maybe limit that somewhat. Like, so they do focus a lot on kind of the domestic policy, regulation of banks, making sure banks hold large reserves and some of these things to kind of cushion the risk that way. But they also say, look, capital market restrictions can be part of a macroprudential policy, right? Of prudent policy can involve some capital controls. So they've become a little bit less dogmatic about opening up financial markets since the Asian financial crisis. But particularly in the 80s and the 90s, they were really dogmatic about like, you must open up your capital markets and do it completely. All openness is good openness, right? And so they've backed away from that some, but there's still a big emphasis from the IMF on reaping the gains from sort of free exchange of capital and letting capital flow from where it's abundant to where it's scarce, and getting economic growth going in this way. All right. So I noted that like the IMF has become less dogmatic about that, right? So there is this evolution in IMF policy over time. And let's map that out a little bit, just in real broad strokes. So I'm doing full justice to none of this, right? But this kind of give you some of the broad patterns. And then if you get interested in this stuff, you can go and kind of delve into kind of each of these kind of crisis episodes and what's going on. So we'll start. I should probably at least make mention of something before the Latin American debt crisis, where some of the early stuff that the IMF was involved in shortly after its birth in the 50s and the 60s, this was largely about helping countries keep their currencies stable as they are either backed by gold or backed by gold plus dollars. And so the IMF's intervening with loans to places like Great Britain and countries in Western Europe, right? So they're lending to rich countries to sort of help them manage balance of payments issues and currency issues. Um, and then the Latin American debt crisis is where the IMF goes large scale into some really serious crises, with the goal of types of conditionality that really restructure the entire economy of the countries that they're lending to. And so during the Latin American debt crisis in the 1980s, so you had these countries that were pursuing import substituting industrialization. and they were starting to accrue large government debts because they were still, while had replaced a lot of imports, they weren't exporting a lot, and they continued to import enough that they were running consistent current account deficits and running consistent government deficits, such that a lot of debt was accumulating, both public and private. And the IMF eventually came in with some bailout loans for the governments that were about to default. And the conditions that they put on those loans were essentially to force a complete end to import substituting industrialization, saying you need to open up to trade, you need to open up to foreign capital, you need to sell off state-owned companies. Like, I mean, restructuring the entire economy. It was really heavy-handed, deep, sort of deep policy reform, reaching way into the details of domestic policy. Um, and like we said, this was a bitter medicine, right? Like, you're in a crisis, and then you're raising taxes and cutting spending and laying off employees at government-owned enterprises. This was super painful, right? It did produce some success. You did get some economic turnarounds here, but you also got a lot of political unrest. You got governments falling. You got crises that sort of spiraled. Um, you got the rise of some, pretty nasty governments in some cases, right? Like, it was a bitter medicine that only sometimes worked, right? So I think there's a very mixed record from the IMF's intervention in Latin America in the 1980s. And one of the if you were to, like, characterize it in a relatively friendly way, you would call it unnecessarily heavy-handed. And you could probably, and if you're more if you're inclined to a more left position, you'd levy a sharper critique than that. Um, Now, the Asian financial crisis, sort of in the late 1990s, the exact financial openness that the IMF had been pushing on these countries and that had been generating a lot of economic growth through the early 90s had a lot to do with causing that crisis, right? Of making these small economies very vulnerable to currency speculators and sort of the vagaries of global financial markets. And the IMF response has been really widely criticized. Again, because it was so much austerity and not enough attention to sort of smoothing out the dip, not having some patience to let the economies recover some before imposing the austerity, but demanding the austerity right away, right? And part of this goes to what the IMF's mission is. That there's nothing in the IMF's mission statement about alleviating poverty or limiting that pain, right? Their whole mission is stabilize the global economy, get the lenders repaid. And their policies reflected that. And so it's actually after the Asian financial crisis, you get a change to the IMF's mission statement. And alleviating poverty becomes part of the IMF's mission. It hadn't been for the first, 50 years of the IMF's existence. That was not part of their mandate. And so it became part of their mandate after the Asian financial crisis. But with all the austerity and all the pain that followed the Asian financial crisis and those sort of during the downturn and sort of during that recovery, in much of Asia, that's referred to as the IMF, not the Asian financial crisis, but the IMF, because a lot of that pain is directly tied to the austerity that the IMF forced on national governments. Um, you get to the European financial crisis, or sort of the global financial crisis, and particularly the eurozone crisis, the eurozone part of that crisis. One of the first countries to really tank in Europe was Iceland, right? Which was it's a very tiny economy, but had a huge banking sector, and so the global financial crisis largely started in the banks with a lot of bad debt. And so Iceland was hit very hard and very early, and so it was one of the first places the IMF intervened. It's a super small economy. The IMF came in with a ton of resources, did a much more kind of smoothing, allowed Iceland a lot more flexibility than was ever given to national governments in Latin America or in Asia during prior crises. And things, and this is like this success story that the IMF likes to point to. And actually, during our group discussion, we'll probably watch a short video that the IMF made about how great they did in Iceland. The rest of the Eurozone response was quite a bit messier, and in part it was messier because of a fundamental conflict between Germany and the IMF. And so you have the IMF, like, yes, they have a new mission statement, but they're also operating in Western Europe, and Western Europe are some of the countries that set policy for the IMF because they were major contributing countries to the IMF's original capital stock. And so right after the global financial crisis, you have a lot of Eurozone members continuing to run large current account deficits, right? So even though they've just been in this huge crisis, they're still running these deficits, right? So this is Greece, this is Spain, this is Portugal. So this sort of situation was worst in Southern Europe in general. And they would have really liked some inflation in the euro to help alleviate the size of both their private and their public debt, right? Like inflation would have been, and as we talked about with inflation, right? That's a competitive devaluation. That's going to help boost exports and reduce imports. It's going to inflate away their debt, right? So it's going to be a solution for them on multiple fronts at once. But Germany steps in and says no very forcefully. And there was a big conflict between Germany and the IMF actually um, about what monetary policy should be and to what extent the bailouts given to Southern European countries should include debt forgiveness. Now, a lot of the debt that was owed by both private parties in Southern Europe and by Southern European governments was owed to private parties and the German government, right? And so Germany really wanted these debts to be repaid, not forgiven. And they didn't want inflation because they were a big creditor nation. And so they didn't want to be paid back in money that was worth less than what they'd loaned out. So Germany was against inflation and was against debt forgiveness. Um, and the IMF was advocating a lot more debt forgiveness in particular. Now, there's a political economist, Jeff Frieden at Harvard. The way he likes to describe this is that Germany shot themselves in the foot while shooting Southern Europe in the face, right? That this was something that was really bad for Southern Europe, but also ended up not even being good for Germany, right? Because it took Southern Europe a long time to recover. I mean, Greece is still struggling to recover from the 2008 financial crisis, right? And we're more than a decade after it. So it really slowed recovery and actually made it much harder for the German economy to get going again, because the rest of Europe around it was not doing well, where forgiving some of this debt, allowing some inflation, probably would have helped Germany as well. So we have a lot of situations where, I mean, the global economy is really hard to manage, and you have these really, you have an organization like the IMF that's super powerful, or you have a large creditor nation with a lot of control over the European banking system, and so you have conflicting interests, but you also have uncertainty about what the right policy is, even if we can agree on what the objectives and the trade-offs are that we're willing to accept. So we have disagreements about how to prioritize different factors in these trade-offs, but also reasonable people can disagree about what policies are going to lead to what ends. So it's really, this is a challenging policy area to get right. And then you also have these more like, I think, sort of what I would consider the core political economy issues of like who makes the calls, whose interests are most important, right? So who holds the power, whose interests are considered, right? That's entirely separate from once we can decide what our priorities are, how do we even implement the correct policy to go after those priorities? There's a whole political battle about what the priorities should be. So we'll be talking through that a lot when we meet in person, and I look forward to doing that. Thanks for being with me.